Dan Bouk, chair of the Department of History at Colgate University and author of Democracy's Data, The Hidden Stories in the US Census and How to Read Them. Dan, thanks so much for coming on today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, Emma, thank you for having me here, for having me back. It's nice to be back on the show.
Oh yeah, of course. Let's talk about the census, right? I mean, for a lot of people, I feel like they go, "Oh, the census is dry. You got to do it every 10 years," and people might think it's some sort of modern invention because of the way the I guess the perception of like the sophistication of it. Oh, you have to aggregate over 330 million people and their data, and yet it was in Article 1 of the Constitution. So it's been around since essentially the founding of the country. I mean, how are they even able to do this within the first 100 years or few decades of the United States?
Oh, no, that's a great question. The census I speak of this as, and all these systems of quantification, all these data systems as things that are really important. They produce Americans' facts. We need them to do really important things like figure out how to allocate power amongst the states. And that was indeed why it's in the Constitution, is so that when it comes time to elect representatives, each state is represented according to its population. When it comes time to elect the president, the Electoral College, the number of votes is dependent on the population of each state. But yeah, how do you do this? Since the very beginning, it was a massive mobilization. To begin with, they would send out marshals. Essentially, they would use a law enforcement organization that would then grab other people and send them out to count one another. By the early 20th century, this turns into this really mass mobilizations of hundreds of thousands of people who are hired by a professional census bureau, trained quickly, and then sent everywhere to knock on doors and try to ask questions and fit these people into this data system.
And you're as well as being a historian, you have a mathematics background, right? If I remember reading correctly, it was not this cut and dry process, and never really has been, where populations are accurately measured. Blending some of your historical background and your mathematical background, what were some of the things that you observed in like just simple data tabulation that is either influenced by politics of the time, or the methodology being really, I guess the short answer of this is, or short question is, has the methodology ever really been sound?
Oh, I mean, sound, right there. That's the difficult word. Like, has the methodology been sound? And there's a couple of ways to answer this, and a couple of like really important moments at which we see the math and the question of the data aggregation all play out. So one of those involves what we might consider a discovery of the undercount. So since the census has been taking place, it's this incredibly difficult operation, and people often assumed that not everyone was being counted. From the very earliest on, we see Thomas Jefferson writing letters to people saying, it says in this first census there were under 4 million, but we're pretty sure we're over that. But it's not really until the early 20th century, when it is a group of Black researchers working for the Census Bureau in a segregated Census Bureau office, who start to do the initial kind of serious scholarly work to show that there was, in fact, an undercount of people in the late 19th century censuses. And then that feeds into a variety of other research throughout the 20th century, such that now we have a vast apparatus. The Census Bureau has a big apparatus constructed on the premise that they're going to count, but they're also not going to be able to count everybody. They'll count some people too frequently, and other people in other groups they'll count too infrequently. This will be an undercount that they want to then evaluate and try to be able to pinpoint and figure out how to decrease that over time. But also it's something we can use to think about how we then apply these numbers and use them in governing.
So my first, when I was reading, your book, my first thought was the census definitely has undercounted poor people, maybe people who were trying to avoid tabulation by the government or did not want certain scrutiny. Black people, I'd imagine there are massive gaps in our history. what are some of the glaring gaps that you observed and that you found in, or you were able to glean to the best of your ability through your research?
Hmm. This is important for us to think about in terms of like modern politics, but also many people who are watching this might have spent at some time trying to think about their family's history, and they would have done genealogical work by looking at the census. And some of them will be very frustrated because they can't seem to find relatives, and they'll think it's their fault, that they're bad researchers. But throughout all these censuses, a lot of people end up going uncounted. Um, I have a friend who likes to say that the census is a great report card for American democracy, not just because of what it reports, but because of the ways it shows us when our democracy has failed to ensure that people have homes, which makes them easier to count, ensure that people are living have a standard of living such that they're going to be in a stable position, which again makes them easier to count, that assures that like we are devoting the resources and energy to get people and try and find them and count them. And to I think your final point, to make sure that people trust the government enough that they're willing to be counted. I mean, because distrust can frequently lead to people not wanting to be counted. I guess the final thing I'll say is whether people are represented is going to significantly affect whether or not they're counted, in part because having a representative who wants you to be counted really matters. I saw this in the 1940 census, where the highest undercount rates by far were in Washington, D.C. And it's not surprising that it was Washington, D.C., because there was no congressperson at that time who had any interest in there being a complete and full count of Washington, D.C. Whereas in other states, even in the Jim Crow South, people would be very sure to try to get a very accurate count, even of African Americans, precisely because they couldn't vote, but their population could be used to justify continued power of white politicians.
Yeah, I mean, I would also guess that one of the through lines of people being undercounted are people who mistrust the government because the government has largely abandoned them. And even if they're included in the census process, it's not for, as you say, actual representative democracy elements. It's more just to, increase the power of said representatives. And so there's no real incentive to participate in that. I'd imagine that was met with some skepticism.
It is. There's a consistent through line in census history of people meeting these questions with skepticism, feeling like this is invasion of privacy. There is, though, I also emphasize the miracle of the census is that people generally do answer the questions. People often meet their neighbor at the door, and enumerators will write home and talk about how they were invited in for coffee, given some pie to eat afterwards, had to fend off multiple dinner invitations, as people are seeing this as a chance to participate. I was talking with some folks yesterday who were telling family stories about their immigrant households that saw that moment to participate in the census as a signifier of their full Americanness, or of African American households in which making sure we and our family and our communities are counted was understood to be a really significant part of what it means to be an American. And so while there are this constant undercurrent of people who don't trust and who don't ask this question, I think one of the more surprising things often is that this thing really shouldn't work. You shouldn't be able to send the 1940 120,000 people all over the country to every single place and try to like literally touch every single of 130 million Americans. And yet it almost does work, which is the really surprising part.
Well, let's talk about 1940 then, because that was the most recent one that you were able to see. Because it's 75 years, and then this data becomes like publicly available. Is that the threshold?
It's 72 years.
72.
Yes, the census.
Well, they've got to make it as just random as humanly possible. But so you were able to get a hold of this trove of data from 1940 as the most recent one available.
Yeah, I started with 1940 in part because at the time I was writing this book, it was the most recently available. The Census Bureau is very concerned about confidentiality for good reason. They want to make sure that people feel like they can report their information without their neighbors or other people taking this information, which might be sometimes very sensitive. And so it is held in complete confidentiality for 72 years, or at least it's supposed to. And I started there because anyone who's doing their own family history is going to start there as well. But then the 1950 census has, as of April 2022, become available. So folks can now continue to look for history in those materials. But 1940 was also significant in its own right. It's a moment at which we first see the federal government start to be interested in things like how much income a person makes in the census. And that's because the government, big business, and labor are all interested in trying to figure out how much people make so they can figure out how big their markets are, so they can think about the standard of living of workers and how they can try to improve those things. The government is for the first time starting to think about the economic lives of ordinary individuals as something that it is responsible for, which prior to that had not been a thing that the census cared about or that the government was particularly responsible for.
And so I guess let's also set the historical context for this time, right? FDR is seeking a third term. The U.S. is about to enter World War II, and the country's still recovering from the Great Depression. All of these things that paint a picture of what this data represents. I mean, how did that historical context inform a lot of what you studied?
Yeah, I talk about the census as an operation that is shrouded in cloaks of boringness, like many of these constant systems. And yet there's a lot of drama in this when you start to look at how this count unfolds. In the midst of Roosevelt's reelection, we see Republicans try to take this as a moment to win some political points. And so they launch a very strenuous attack on including this income question and are able to drum up some really substantial support. I can kind of see the letters of people coming in, including one Indiana woman identifying herself as a housewife who talked about imagining this census enumerator coming to her door. And she said, she made a little drawing on her letter that said, "I've got a pair of brass toes ready for the enumerator." And she imagines herself kicking this enumerator in the butt out the door. So there's political concern about invasions of privacy and about this new income question. And then to your point about entering World War II, that starts to really powerfully shape what is happening in the Census Bureau as they start to see that their resources are going to be drawn down as the U.S. enters the war, and they start to try and think out ways that they can contribute to that war effort to really terrible results.
Well, they now have data on who's a Japanese American. So can you just talk about what the role that the census played in the internment of the Japanese?
Right. So I think about this story in part through the life of Iwao Moriyama, who is a Japanese-American Census Bureau official. He's working in the vital statistics operation. He has a brother who's living in Japan. His parents are Japanese-American living in San Francisco. And he, writing about this, is talking about what it's like to be in the Census Bureau, recognizing how crucial Census Bureau information is to making possible the entire war effort. Now, some of that is because in order to run the arsenal of democracy, all of these industries that rely on American workers, Roosevelt says they have to be citizens. But most people don't have proof of citizenship in 1940. The Social Security card is at most 3 years old in 1940. Many people don't have birth certificates. So they turn to the census and say, could you provide me a certified record that somebody thought I was a citizen in 1940? And they start producing all of these certified records as the only proof of citizenship to allow them to get jobs. So these are hundreds and thousands of these requests that are being processed. While the Bureau is doing this, it's also trying to count people and produce its statistics that it's supposed to produce from the 1940 census. And in the midst of all this, it says, we want to contribute to this war effort. We're going to produce special tabulations at very small levels where all Japanese Americans can be found on the West Coast. And so when the Roosevelt administration, operating out of fears that are really unfounded, there's no evidence at all that Japanese Americans are involved in any way in sabotage or are real threats, decides that they're going to remove all Japanese Americans from the West Coast. They end up relying on the census data information to direct that activity.
That is an especially dark usage of some of this data, and I think echoes what we saw in modern times. A little bit of what the Trump administration was trying to do with the census was to zero in on who was here illegally and who was, trying to target Latino communities in this country. And that has been, I mean, I'm curious about your what you found throughout history. Has that emphasis changed from administration to administration, targeting specific groups with the census and changing questions on it maybe to achieve outcomes that target minority groups?
Right. Well, so one thing I'll say about that, we certainly do see the way in which, for instance, before the census questions in 1940 start thinking about economic issues, throughout the 1870s through to the 1920s, much of the census was devoted to questions about where a person and their parents were born. And those were questions that the Congress put into these as they, from 1870 through 1920, 1929, were involved in these heavy debates about the degree to which immigration to the United States should be allowed. And we see from 1870 to 1920, all these laws passed to limit immigration, first from Asia and then from outside of the Western Hemisphere entirely, almost entirely. And so that's a way in which the census drives and supports these debates about who is an American and who should be allowed in. But the other thing I should say, because it has to do with what you're talking about in terms of the Trump administration, is that the story about Japanese incarceration, we need to tell it because it's important to think about how this information can be weaponized. But it's equally important to recognize that the Bureau and the laws changed in response to these kinds of weaponizations. These confidentiality protections have been put in place, have been reestablished to protect individuals from having their information surfaced. Similarly, special procedures have been put in place to try and make it so that it's harder to get fine-grained data about vulnerable populations. And I say that because one of the great fears, one of the things that happened with the Trump administration was by even telling the story, raising the idea of a citizenship question, one can try to drive down participation, decrease trust. And that has its own cost, because if people aren't counted, if their communities aren't counted, they don't get representation, their status is not recognized, and they can't get the resources and the attention that they need.
Well, it's good those guardrails are in place. I'm blanking on it, but it seems like that, that did that not end up happening? What actually ended up happening with the Trump administration's effort on that front? They weren't able to do it, right?
Yeah, it was they kept trying in some ways, but the first key moment that happened was having been sued and brought ultimately to the Supreme Court. It became clear that while the Department of Commerce claimed that the Department of Justice had asked for this question so that they could enforce the Voting Rights Act, it became clear they had made that up. That in fact it had gone the other way around. They decided ahead of time they wanted this probably because it would be seen as a way to drive down participation from certain groups. And the Supreme Court said, look, you can't just make up reasons for this. That is in fact not legal. But it also did sound a little bit like the Chief Justice invited them to say the real reason, that if you just give us the real reason, which is you want to drive down participation, that might be fine, but you can't just make up a reason. We were saved to a great degree by a printing deadline. The Census Bureau needed to print a whole bunch of pieces of paper with all the questions on it, and there was not enough time to make that printing deadline while also continuing to appeal the census. So we were saved the citizenship question in large part because of these strange little logistical issues.
Gotcha. All right. Well, that's bureaucracy turning in our favor, I guess here. I was curious too. You wrote about how during this 1940 period, a lot of the way that the census was taken was through kind of households being at the center of the census, and there's a lot of assumptions made in those instances. The man is the head of the household. They have a spouse. That spouse is a woman. Queer history in this country has a lot of gaps, but my guess is that this kind of data is reflective of those gaps.
Mm-hmm. We often forget that the way the census works is that it assumes people live, as you said, in a household, that they live in a family of some sort. It's not ultimately a count of individuals. It rather is a count of how people, in order to count, you have to fit into a family. And then the people who make those questions have certain assumptions about what that family looks like. One of the neat things, though, about being able to dig into all of the individual data and why looking back at these records is so revealing, is that you realize lots of people don't fit in that simple kind of household, but they still do get counted in one way or another. And so for me, one of the things that was particularly interesting was thinking about how this label called the partner was often used as a way to get people to fit, to make them count, to put them into a household. And it didn't mean necessarily the way partner means a romantic relationship to us today, although it might in some occasions. But it was used in all these different ways in Hawaii, in the colonies, when Hawaii was still a territory, in obviously queer communities, in other places in which people just didn't fit into this ideal of what a family should look like. And it turns out there's people like that all over the United States whose stories can be told if we just are willing to dig through all of this material.
Gotcha. And I mean, would you also say that some of those assumptions kind of reproduced certain class dynamics that often were more favorable to white people, that kind of family that you describe? Without the deeper digging, though, you see how history and the data that's used to inform our historical understanding is based on a series of assumptions that are not scientific or completely devoid of politics. They're informed by the politics and the beliefs of the time.
Yeah, that's such an important point. These seemingly objective facts that look like they just are kind of descending from this apparatus have infused into them this politics. You can think of the census as like an infrastructure of identities. It provides the acceptable categories. It produces these tables showing us what America looks like according to those categories. But then as a result, it can limit our sense of who's actually there, who actually counts. So the partner was for instance, this category, this label that allowed people to be counted. But then when the actual 1940 census statistics were published, there were no partners. All those folks were then moved over and stuck, regardless of how they might be identified by their enumerator, they are all stuck in this large group of lodgers. And so there's a massive queer history and a massive history of people who are in marginal positions and marginal places that get kind of just shunted into a big bucket where they can reside in the statistics, but we lose them from this national story, at least until now. That's part of the thing I'm trying to do in this book.
Well, it really is a great history of the census and important to understand how we collect our population data from the outside of this country to now. Dan Bouk, chair of the Department of History at Colgate University and author of Democracy's Data, The Hidden Stories in the US Census and How to Read Them. Dan, thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure.